split into groups. Okay, I've just, the structure, non-structure thing has been worrying me throughout this kind of thing, so I'm going to do you, and the microphone, which hasn't been sufficiently worrying me, obviously. The structure, non-structure thing and how we get the balance right. But I think I'm going to do you in sort of 3 topics again, like yesterday. So groups 1 and 2, and this involves something of a comment from me on George's paper. When you were talking about Barcelona and the gentrification process, you used the term expelled. The people were expelled from communities on several occasions. And I wondered if that wasn't in some cases a slight... I mean, there are projects of gentrification which absolutely involve expulsion. They involve levelling the ground, removing people's houses, building motorways, building cultural facilities, and literally moving people out, right? And then there are projects of gentrification which involve capital investment in a neighbourhood, lack of rent control, which raises rents for people, and they move out. And it's a slower process, and it takes longer. And then there are projects of gentrification, of which you see many in a city like London, which are, I'm thinking of Hoxton, for example, now in East London, which has undergone a huge kind of art market-led boom on the back of the young British artists, etc., which are processes of gentrification whereby the area itself will still retain a lot of social housing and a lot of poor people, but they will not in any way benefit from the economic development that's gone on around them. And I think all those processes are very different. So I think talking about expelling people makes it seem as if gentrification is a more planned and a more singular thing than it actually is. So I just wanted the first 2 groups to really talk about issues of gentrification with kind of examples, if you can, of these different processes. Because I think the reason it's important to think about the different processes is because the way that you resist gentrification is affected by the kind of gentrification you get. I mean, you may have to sort of arm yourself, or you may just have to do things about rent control. And those 2 things are, are rather different. So I like the first 2 groups to talk about gentrification with kind of examples of gentrification, where it works, where it's been resisted, not where it works, where it's less harmful, where it's been resisted, how it might be resisted, those kind of issues. Second 2 groups, and I have to say that you do have to be at a conference of theorists for people to find it in any way surprising that there's a gap between discourse and practice. But anyway, let's all accept there's a gap between sort of discourse and practice. In fact, I have a very good friend who runs creative industries for London, and he describes the creative industries discourse as useful idiocy, and very self-consciously as a way that he can fund arts projects. This happens all the time. People are very conscious of this thing. They're not idiots. They know, there's a very conscious process of using the discourse in order to fund quite often quite traditional arts projects, and sometimes kind of interesting popular cultural projects and everything in between. So I want the groups sort of 3 and 4 rather, to come up with some kind of examples of this discourse practice breaking down in kind of interesting ways, what people are doing with this discourse that might be positive, where using the discourse becomes overwhelming and you can't do anything positive with it. That kind of, I want them to debate those kind of things, but I want you to give me kind of examples of where you think that's happening. And the third one, the final 2 groups, I think we should have something on textual things, but I'm going to leave that for the afternoon and somebody who knows more about that than me. The third one, the question that's bothering me, and quite often does bother me, is the sort of why culture. And I think David's point at the end was really helpful, because I think there's been a bit of a tendency to talk about using culture for social processes as if neoliberalism invented it. Right. And in fact, we've been doing it, since the Roman times, and certainly Victorian England was a huge example of using culture for both economic and social ends. So it's not a recent thing. But what I think is interesting is, why does anyone think that building a museum is going to cut crime? Why does anybody think that putting in a museum is going to cut crime? So why culture? Or art centres? Why culture, particularly for these kind of social ends, for these kind of issues of social policy? Why do we use culture to tackle issues of social policy? And I know that's a slightly philosophical and slightly more vague one for the last 2 groups, but it's the best I can do, I'm afraid. So, given that...
I was going to suggest that maybe we break into different groups to sort of re-lubricate the discussion.
You came... You can have a pass if you really want to, but you're in your same groups. And can we come back at 12:30? 12:35, 40 minutes. Am I on? Yeah. Okay. Right, group one. I'm looking over here because I think you're sort of located over here, but you may not be.
No, not anymore. I think we could.
Oh, it's anarchy. Okay.
Okay, thanks. So we had a very wide-ranging discussion that was kind of a mixture of examples with discussion. So I'll just go through it as it kind of came about there. So we started with an example of Somerville in the Boston area and how rent control was, we're talking about gentrification, by the way, and how rent control was actually voted out. So we had that kind of a bizarre example. And the argument against that was that it was artificial, or the argument for voting it out was that it was artificially distorting the rent market, which of course we concluded was like kind of BS, but anyway. Then Suhana gave this amazing example of gentrification in Bangalore. So I'm going to sort of summarize this, but you might want to talk to her about it because it's pretty fascinating. So she was talking about Bangalore being an example in India of what a global city should look like. And the main issue is around the widening of roads. And in turn, this means the sort of taking out of properties that are already there. So she talked about how bureaucrats are choosing to follow a US model of the Silicon Valley, and this has in turn turned into complicated debates over who owns the city, and in turn a rebound into greater transportation by car on these roads. So Suhana actually lives in one of these houses and was telling us about how there's no formal compensation for the destruction of property that will result in the widening of roads, but there's this system called the transfer of development right, which is essentially that somebody can pay someone in one of these houses money to gain the ability to build extra floors on other buildings throughout the city of Bangalore. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. And in turn, this has come back into other issues, and as she stated, is kind of not working because there's other systems of bribery and corruption that are undermining even that system of compensation. And then we got into a bit of a discussion about how global cities, the term itself, often refers to the creation of a city for a global elite rather than a city that is, a great city for everybody. Then we discussed a little bit about how gentrification is often tied up with environmental architecture, so building with greater developments in downtown areas at greater heights rather than sprawl, so that the issue often dissolves into environmentalism versus housing rights for all. And we had several examples of places where this had been a conflict in the cities that we all lived in. Kirsten brought up Vancouver and the downtown east side, and the result that the Olympics have had on that community, which is extremely poverty-stricken, but has had to face eviction, the building of luxury condos, all within this idea of cleaning up the city for the global elite from the global cities who will be coming to Vancouver for the Olympics in 2010. And she also talked about the resistance to this, so squatting movements, banner drops that use the theme of homes, not games, which has become quite popular and, easy to use. And then Melbourne was brought up, and how in the Commonwealth Games, people were given homeless people were given bus tickets to be bussed out for the duration of the games and then brought back in when the games are on, which in turn became a conversation about new immigrants and places where gentrification moves into the outskirts of cities so that the suburbs become the places where things are happening, while the Richard, Florida style of gentrification downtown actually results in generic city spaces. We had plenty more examples. We got into talking about bus service versus rail service and thinking about being right here. And finally, we concluded on two things. One was surveillance that I think might come up later, so I'll just kind of leave that one for now. And the other one was this kind of paradoxical idea of people who live in places that have gentrified but actually own their property. So one of them was East London, and working class peoples who own their houses, bought them for very little money, and have become rich overnight. And we were talking about some of the social consequences of that in terms of increased drug or alcohol abuse, also in terms of losing one's roots and various other problems, and also maybe for some people very positive results. And would anyone else like to add anything?
Yes. Okay. So picking up where group one ended, so I can maybe transition a little bit here. I think that it's interesting. We also talked about, and in particular, I'd like to thank Andrew who brought this up, about the benefits of gentrification for lower middle class, working class property owners, and the way in which their ownership of property is an important, really important component of their livelihood, and so it can be a huge benefit for this group when gentrification comes to their area. We then moved on to also a discussion of several themes. In particular, I'm just going to highlight a few, and I hope other people will add to this, maybe. We talked about how it can be self-negating in the sense that, on the one hand, there is this discourse around wanting to have artists living in the area, but then, of course, what happens is that artists don't have a lot of money, right? So maybe they're even squatting, and when the development comes to the area, they're priced out, and it goes somewhere else. So the whole process, of wanting to have an arts-based economy in an area can actually price the artist out of the area. And we talked about some examples of that, in particular in downtown areas. We also talked about how we can see that gentrification really moves things around rather than doing anything to improve the overall quality of life for the larger community. Because what will happen, for instance, if somebody builds, a shopping district in a new shopping district in some area, the existing shopping district, loses, traffic, and as everyone goes to the new shopping area. So you see where, and then when it comes to issues of, security and crime, if one area is targeted for gentrification, then that crime just moves to another area that is no longer being targeted. So we were, and in particular, Alejandro was a little skeptical, and maybe a little cynical, but maybe justifiably so, about the ways and the benefits of even this communities working in networked ways from below that George spoke about in his talk. That even these kinds of gentrification practices can turn out to just be a process of moving around where the crime, where the money is, all that sort of stuff. So I wanted to talk about. We were talking a lot about cities, and so I was interested in discussing gentrification in rural areas, and I used North Adams as an example, and Andrew also brought up the towns along the Hudson Valley, and North Adams, Massachusetts is where there's a giant art, Mass MoCA. If you don't know it, it's Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. I love it. But it's this town that had previously been industrial, and traffic from tourist circuits in the Berkshires near Tanglewood, from Boston and New York. It's already in a place where that tourism is happening, and so Andrew pointed out that in order for a town outside of a city to experience this kind of redevelopment in an artist-based economy, it already needs to, be in that kind of circuit in order to benefit from that. And he raised the issue of Soho as kind of serving as a template for the development of arts-based economies, and reminded us that although this may be a classic example, it's a very unique situation, and so maybe we should think twice about looking into this as an example of how things should work for other places. And we ended on this discussion of city beautification projects and the way in which how we might see these as having some things in common with the move towards an artist-based economy, but also being kind of different because it's also about nature and bringing nature into the city. And I was interested also in thinking about how we might see that as implicating concerns about the gendered elements of revitalization practices. So.
Great, fantastic. Just before we leave the gentrification topic, there's seeing the London Review of Books outside reminded me about 2 issues ago, there's a great piece by Ian Sinclair about the preparations for the London Olympics, which touches on many of these issues. It's a fantastic piece. And there's a bit where he's describing going to the kind of marketing room or the sort of show home bit where they tell you all the wonderful things that are going to be happening in East London when the Olympics comes. And the marketing woman comes up to him and says, do you have any questions? And he says, just one. How do you get away with it? And it's just a great piece. So after that, what are we doing now? Yes, discourse and practice. Do we have number 1 in discourse and practice? i.e. group 3?
That's Juan.
We had a extraordinary discussion. It was, in fact, so good that we have decided to copyright it. You can have access to it for a small fee. No, we talked about a number of cases. The example of Plymouth Rock and a forthcoming studio project was mentioned by Richard. This is something ongoing and to be built still, but a place that has historically been defined by a rock and the reenactments of the pilgrims all of a sudden is now facing the idea of a big studio being built there. So the questions about locals and outsiders and were raised. George mentioned the example of El Salvador, where after failed policies of mano dura, Giuliani-style kind of policing against gangs and gangs violence have miserably failed, there are some on the ground considering the possibility of going this other neoliberal way concerning youth and gang violence, which could be an opening for cultural policy-oriented initiatives. Christian mentioned the example of Palermo Soho, a neighborhood, Tony neighborhood in Buenos Aires, Argentina, that has been developed mostly for tourism, and so he described this as fake bohemians, and we have some conversations about against what kind of standard is bohemianness being defined. I brought up the issue of a recent experience of mine in Santa Monica, 3rd Street Promenade, where I saw a street performance where the 4 performers had guilt-tripped 4 color performance, Latinos and black performers, had beautiful bodies in exhibit, had guilt-tripped a mostly white audience into giving a significant amount of money, while the performance was mostly about this issue. That is to say, how much money do you need to pay for this to be a fair exchange? And there were at least 2 readings of this. One that emphasized how neoliberal discourse and the discourse of payment had taken over the creativity of these artists, or on the other one, how this performance was itself a reflection on their conditions of production and work. Annette brought up the very important issue of how is practice being defined in all these conversations, and she suggested that there might be an excess to the concept of practice that cannot be, that is by definition non-measurable in terms of deliverables, to which George said, you still have to provide the measurements and the deliverables in any project so that the project gets funded. Whether you can measure the impacts afterwards, that's another issue, but then the money has been well spent anyway. In summarizing, the questions are not original. The questions that we asked over and over about these examples were who benefits, who pays, who gets hired, what are the consequences for the locals?
Right, thank you.
Group 4 decided collectively to become unstructured, so we won't take much time. We talked a little bit about the ways that there can be a divide between discourse and practice. For example, the people doing the discourse can decide to put something into practice, but then there's no infrastructure in the place where they want to develop something, so the money ends up going somewhere else because an infrastructure already exists. Or a group that wants practice can exploit discourse for their benefit. We also talked we ran with the idea that showed up earlier in the talk about getting the right bodies in the museums, and how that, whether or not that's something to reach for. And I came up with the example that provided a lot of fodder for our discussion of the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum. And its First Saturdays program. The Brooklyn Museum, more than most museums, has curated exhibits that are geared toward local communities. And on the first Saturday of every month, the museum is open late into the night for free, and people come. People who normally wouldn't go to museums come and experience things, and their dances and their cultural events in addition to the exhibits. And First Saturdays funded by Target. Target. And Target also recently became a business with a presence in New York. And their first business, I think, was the one just down the street from the Brooklyn Museum of Art on Flatbush and Atlantic in the area of the Atlantic Yards project, a project of gentrification that is facing a lot of resistance in terms of eminent domain. Most of the resistance coming from the affluent members of the precariat, rather than people who others say would be most affected by the construction of a business and residential space that would be larger than what was the World Trade Center in square footage. And then I also talked about the recent Murakami exhibit that opened at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and how all of these issues became tied up with each other at the opening benefit for that exhibit, which featured a performance by Kanye West, and it was in honor of Ratner, one of the man who's responsible for the Atlantic Yards project, and the opening gala was faced with protesters outside protesting the construction of the Atlantic Yards project down the street, and at the same time, inside authentic Murakami bags were being sold in a space that recreated the alleys of Canal Street, where fake Vuitton bags were being sold until just a few weeks before the Murakami exhibit opened, when a police raid basically cleared out Canal Street of all of those fake bag sellers. So it just provided an instance of where all of these ideas that we can talk about are running up against each other.
What's the name of the exhibit?
The Murakami exhibit.
Murakami. Thanks.
Okay. That's working? All right. So a lot of the questions that we actually raised talking about this why culture notion, museums moving in and, meaning to sort of sweep away crime as a general, solvent technique, do touch upon a lot of what's been said so far. We talked a lot about this idea of culture as status. So, a lot of who gets to consume it, and as well as, of course, who's disseminating it. Particularly in relation to a lot of different spaces that we as a group have, lived in, worked in, studied in, et cetera, either in the US or Europe. And some examples given include in Amsterdam right now, there's a project to give funding to artists so that they can buy up individual spaces where women were previously working, displaying themselves on the street, to so that they can be turned into murals or spaces to display paintings, sort of mini galleries. And so that's sort of one example of that sort of notion of privilege, as well as a Native American museum that was in New York up until 1987 in where it was in Harlem, West Harlem. That was eventually moved out because it couldn't be maintained with the excuse that people just don't want to go there, so you can't be here. So yeah, again, these notions of who's inhabiting these spaces, when they're pushed out, why they're pushed out, a regulation largely related to racial issues, bodily issues, the desire to sort of punish those that don't fit in with a certain vision of maybe this utopian or fantasy space for a particular environment related to its culture. Any other examples that you all wanted to really touch on? 'Cause we gave so many. We mostly just sort of moved around the nation and, like I said, parts of Europe with the different types of examples of this. So.
Great, thank you. Final group.
Okay, we started our discussion with a question that Kate posed, the question of why a museum is assumed to reduce crime, and we talked a bit about how art is seen as productive or couched in civilizational terms when it comes from the top, and especially in a lot of the cities of the global south. And we gave the example of Islamic Cairo in Egypt and the transformation of a whole area of old Cairo into the world's largest open-air museum. And the kind of implication of that, the regulatory processes that came into this transformation. So, and the logic of this transformation is that the government is gonna place surveillance cameras to protect the tourists. A lot of the people who are part of the informal economy would be formalized. So instead of being itinerant sellers or producers of products, they would sell cultural artifacts to tourists. And Ammar mentioned the fact that our notion of crime should be expanded to include things like informality, noise pollution, and the transformation of those spaces into museum-like spaces lead to some kind of deindustrialization and the change of function of those spaces from spaces that produce products into cultural spaces that sell cultural products. We talked a bit about the use of art as a way to diffuse political problems, and the example of the Barenbaum and Edward Said Orchestra in case of bringing Palestinian and Israeli children through music, and how this is seen as a way of promoting peaceful coexistence without, and we also discussed the problems of this approach and what it does to the kind of the political issues, the refugee issues, and so forth. And we talked a bit about the Ireland example and the use, the recent project of repainting a lot of the political murals and funding artists to do that, and the kind of new murals that are in place that have no significance to the communities, and so they become kind of sterilized forms of creative expressions that are not relevant to the history of the communities they are in.
Fantastic, that was great. George, do you want to very quickly respond, or do you want to leave your response till this
I
afternoon?
want to pull an Andrew Ross maneuver.
Make it a quick one then.
No, that's it.
Oh, okay, fine.
Could I just add
Of course.
quick example?
Yeah, of course.
I think that one is the Amsterdam example that was brought up by your group. It's a quite complex case actually. The red light district is barely, excuse the pun, at the center of Amsterdam. You can barely walk across the center of Amsterdam without walking through the red light district, and at the same time you get people, if you spend any time in Amsterdam, you get stopped 20 minutes away, which in Amsterdam is a long way away, right? From the red light district by, middle-aged, middle-class Japanese tourists, Israeli teenagers, or
Drunken Brits.
yeah, I was going to say English football fans asking where's the red light district, right? So it's a place that marks Amsterdam in a certain way, right, as an attraction, and at the same time, it's a complex space for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is that the women who parade themselves right in the windows are not from Amsterdam, indeed not from the Netherlands at all. They're East European or Asian, and maybe to some degree Caribbean, right? So they're ethno-racially other from elsewhere. The trade is largely controlled by Russian and Israeli organized crime gangs that are in some ways extremely violent and a problem for the securitization in some extended sense, not just of that space, but of the city and maybe the country more largely. So it's a very complex, and there's an attempt by the city to, women are licensed in order to practice, but at the same time there's an attempt to reframe or reculturalize that space precisely in the face of a very long history. So it's a very, very complex moment. Two other quick examples. One is sort of from the 1990s, and that's the People's Museum in Cape Town, which is a museum of mixed race, in South African terms, colored life, right? Which really was a people's museum. I mean, and to some extent maybe remains. I mean, it's sort of gotten less presence lately. But certainly in the late 1990s, was enormously important for the revival of District 6 for the people who lived there, right? And gave those people a voice rather than was simply a place that people from the outside would visit, and worked very well for that transitional period in Cape Town and South African history more generally. And the third is a very different kind of example. I don't know if you know about it. Just on the edge of Beijing, by a regional development sort of area, borough, there's the development of a completely new art city. I mean, it started out. I mean, it's really, really interesting. It started out as a kind of cultural avant-garde place because it was a cheap place for artists to actually find spaces to live and work. And on top of that, the region has funded the development of a completely new design city of the major cultural avant-garde in Beijing, and they're all sort of moving to this. It's an incredible space, and they built a museum, really a big gallery for display. They're building a major archive of Asian film with an exhibit, filming exhibition space, and then they built maybe 200 homes, designed homes that are extraordinary. I mean, that are contemporary, but sort of based on more traditional Chinese design, and invited sort of key artists to actually move their lives there, right? In order to practice, and that's exactly. I mean, it's connected to the kind of logics of work, but it's a counter move because it's moving outside the city, right? I mean, it's not. It's 798 recreated outside the city because 798, which is this factory turned into cultural space at the central edge of Beijing, is now just a tourist attraction that they'll be sort of none of the producers or the cultural producers themselves are interested in promoting anymore. And so, I mean, it's an interesting inversion of some of the logic at work while playing on the very same logics of neoliberal cultural configuration.